Tonight on Gay Timeline, we are turning back the clock to the decks of a destroyer in the Pacific, 1944. The sea stretches in every direction, endless and dark. Below deck, men sleep shoulder to shoulder in hammocks that swing with the roll of the ship. The air smells like salt, diesel, sweat, and something you cannot quite name. Fear, maybe, or hope. Among them are men who carry a secret heavier than any ammunition they will ever load. They are gay. They are sailors. They are at war. And if their shipmates find out what they are, they will face a different kind of battle. One with no medals, no honor, only discharge, disgrace, and a paper trail that will follow them home. They had no word for what they were, but they had each other. And tonight, we say their names out loud, because they could not. I am Julian, and this is Gay Timeline, the channel that brings forgotten gay history back into the light, one quiet night at a time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. For most of history, these men were alone. They wrote letters no one would read. They loved in rooms no one would visit. Tonight, we keep them company. That is all sleep needs to be, a quiet act of refusing to let someone be forgotten. Have you ever wondered what it was like to fall in love while watching for enemy submarines? Have you ever wondered how gay men survived in the most masculine institution in America, the wartime Navy? How did they find each other in a sea of 16 million uniforms? What did they say to each other when the lights went out? What did they risk when they reached for a hand in the dark? Have you ever wondered who was discharged for love instead of cowardice? Have you ever wondered what happened to the men who came home with blue discharge papers that followed them for the rest of their lives? Have you ever thought about the sailor who kept a photograph hidden in his locker? Not of a girl back home, but of the man sleeping 3 hammocks over. Congratulations. You have just enlisted in the United States Navy, and it is 1942. You are about to spend the next 3 years surrounded by more men than you have ever seen in your life. Let us see if you survive with your heart intact. Good luck. The first thing you need to understand about the wartime Navy is that it was everywhere. 16 million Americans served during World War II. Roughly 4 million of them were in the Navy or Coast Guard. 4 million men on ships, on bases, in port cities from San Diego to Honolulu to Manila. The sheer scale of mobilization meant that gay men could not avoid it. If you were between 18 and 35, you were expected to serve. There was no app to find other gay men. There were no support groups. There was no language most of them even had for what they felt. The term homosexual existed, but it was clinical, medical, something whispered by doctors and psychiatrists. Most men just knew they were different. They knew they looked at other men the way they were supposed to look at women, and they knew that admitting it out loud could destroy their lives. The military had rules about homosexuality, clear rules. The Articles of War, which governed military justice, made sodomy a criminal offence punishable by court-martial, dishonourable discharge, and up to 10 years in prison. But here is the strange thing about World War II. The military needed bodies more than it needed purity. In the years leading up to the war, the Navy had discharged gay men quietly, with little fanfare. A few cases, a few scandals, nothing systematic. Then, December 7th, 1941 happened. Pearl Harbor. Suddenly, the country was at war on 2 fronts, and the Navy needed every man it could get. The historian Alan Berube spent years documenting this period. He found that in the early years of the war, from 1941 to 1943, the rate of discharge for homosexuality was surprisingly low. Not because the Navy had become tolerant, but because they were too busy building the largest naval force in human history. They needed gunners, radio men, cooks, medics, engineers. They needed men who could load torpedoes and swab decks and stand watch in the middle of the Pacific, while kamikaze planes screamed out of the sky. If a man could do the job, the Navy mostly looked the other way. This created a strange, fragile window. For the first time in American history, millions of men were living in close quarters, away from the watchful eyes of parents, churches, and small-town neighbors. They were sharing bunks. They were showering together. They were writing letters home about their best buddy in the platoon. And some of them, more than anyone wanted to admit, were falling in love. Let me tell you about a man named Robert Fleischer. He enlisted in the Navy in 1943, fresh out of high school in Ohio. He was 19. He had never kissed anyone. He did not know he was gay. He had no framework for it, no word that felt right. He just knew that when he looked at the other boys in gym class, something stirred in him that did not match what everyone said he was supposed to feel. Boot camp was 8 weeks at Great Lakes Naval Training Station, just north of Chicago. 15,000 men cycled through every few weeks. Robert remembers the first night in the barracks, rows and rows of metal bunks, the smell of new wool uniforms and industrial soap, the sound of men snoring, coughing, whispering in the dark. He remembers lying there thinking, I am surrounded by men. That was the thought. Not fear, not shame, just a quiet, dizzying awareness. He met a man named Jack on the rifle range. Jack was from California, loud, funny, the kind of guy who made everyone laugh during drills. They became friends fast. Navy friendships form quickly, because you are thrown together with no choice, no privacy, no escape. You either bond or you go insane. Robert and Jack started spending their off hours together. They would sit on the edge of the pier, smoke cigarettes they had traded for, talk about home. Jack talked about his mother. Robert talked about his kid sister. They did not talk about what they were both starting to feel. But it was there, in the way Jack's knee pressed against Robert's when they sat close, in the way Robert found excuses to brush past Jack in the narrow corridors of the barracks, in the way they both volunteered for the same watch shifts so they could stand together in the dark, staring at the lake, not saying the thing that was louder than any words. One night, 2 weeks before graduation, Jack kissed him. It was fast, reckless. They were alone in the head, the Navy term for bathroom, at 3 a.m. Everyone else was asleep. Jack had just made some joke about how Robert looked like a drowned rat after a surprise inspection in the rain. Robert laughed. Jack stepped closer, and then his mouth was on Robert's. It lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then Jack pulled back, eyes wide, terrified. He said, I should not have done that. Robert said, do it again. They did. For 2 weeks they found every stolen moment they could. A storage closet, the back of the chapel during a film screening, the darkened corner of the barracks after lights out, when you could hear 70 men breathing in the dark, and you had to stay silent, absolutely silent, because one noise would wake someone and it would all be over. Robert said later, years later, in an oral history interview archived at the University of California, he said those 2 weeks were the most terrifying and most alive he had ever felt. He was 19. He was in love. He was about to be sent to the Pacific, where men were dying every day, and he did not know if he would live long enough to ever feel this again. Then graduation came. They got their orders. Robert was assigned to a destroyer in the South Pacific. Jack was sent to a cruiser in the Atlantic. Different ships, different oceans. They had one night together before they shipped out. They went into Chicago, which was crawling with sailors on leave. The city had become a major liberty port, thousands of men flooding in every weekend, looking for a drink, a dance, a girl, a moment of forgetting before they went to war. Robert and Jack found a bar in a neighborhood Jack had heard about from another sailor, a place where men danced with men if you knew to go late enough, if you walked past the front room into the back. The bar was called The Cabin. It does not exist anymore. But in 1943, it was one of a handful of places in Chicago where gay servicemen could go and for a few hours not pretend. They drank. They danced. Badly. Robert had never danced with another man before. Jack had once in San Francisco before the war, at a house party where someone played Billie Holiday on a phonograph and men held each other in a crowded living room and no one called the cops. That night at the cabin, they were careful. You had to be. Shore Patrol walked the streets looking for sailors breaking curfew or getting into fights. If they walked into a bar and saw two men dancing too close, holding each other too long, they would arrest both, haul them back to base, and start an investigation that could end in court-martial. But inside the cabin, in that back room thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of spilled beer and the sound of men laughing like they had nowhere else to be, Robert and Jack held each other. They did not talk. They just swayed to the music. And Robert thought, this is what it feels like. The next morning, they said goodbye at the train station. Jack gave Robert a photograph, just a standard ID photo from boot camp, the kind every sailor had taken. He wrote on the back, "For Robert, remember me." Robert kept it in his locker for the next 2 years. He never saw Jack again. Let me pause here and tell you what the odds were. Robert Fleischer survived the war. Jack did not. His cruiser, the USS Indianapolis, delivered components of the atomic bomb to Tinian Island in July 1945, then was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine on its way back. Of the 1,195 men aboard, only 316 survived. Jack was not one of them. Robert found out 3 weeks after the war ended. A letter came from Jack's mother. She had found Robert's name in Jack's address book, thought he was a friend from boot camp, wanted to let him know. She wrote, "Jack spoke of you often. He said you were a good friend." Robert kept that letter for the rest of his life. He died in 2003. The letter was in a box of papers his niece donated to an LGBTQ archive in Ohio. On the back of the envelope, Robert had written in pencil, "The only man I ever loved." That is one story. There are thousands more. Most of them were never written down. Most of the men never told anyone. They came home, got married, had kids, lived quiet lives, and took the truth to their graves. But some of them left traces, letters, diaries, photographs with inscriptions that meant more than they seemed. And some of them, decades later, when it was finally safer to speak, sat down with historians and said, "Let me tell you what it was really like." Alan Berube spent the 1980s interviewing gay World War II veterans. His book, Coming Out Under Fire, is built on their voices. One vet told him, "The Navy was the queerest place I have ever been." Another said, "I met more gay men in the service than I did in the next 20 years of civilian life." The military threw millions of men together with no privacy, no boundaries, and no way to avoid each other. For gay men, it was way shianda, dangerous, yes. But it was also the first time many of them realized they were not alone. Shore leave was when you found each other. Every port city had its gay bars, its cruising areas, its networks of men who knew where to go and what to say. San Diego, San Francisco, Honolulu, New York. These cities swelled with servicemen during the war. The gay bars swelled too. In San Francisco, there was the Black Cat, a bar in North Beach where opera singers performed and sailors danced with each other openly, until the Shore Patrol showed up, and then everyone scattered. In New York, there were the piers, the parks, the bathhouses, the bars in Greenwich Village where men met men and no one asked too many questions. In Honolulu, which became a major staging ground for the Pacific Fleet, the city had its own underground world. Hotel Street was the official red light district, lined with bars, brothels, tattoo parlors, all catering to servicemen on leave. But a few blocks away, there were quieter places. A bar called the Waikiki Tavern, a stretch of beach near Diamond Head where men met after dark. A hotel where the desk clerk looked the other way if two sailors checked in together. You learned the signals, a certain look, a specific question. "You wearing your dog tags tonight?" was code. It meant you were interested. You were available. You knew what you were doing. You learned which bars were safe and which were traps. Some bars were monitored by Naval Intelligence. Some bartenders were informants. If you were not careful, you could walk into a bar, buy a drink for the wrong guy, and find yourself arrested before the night was over. But you also learned to read a room. You learned who else was looking. You learned the difference between a straight sailor who would punch you and a straight sailor who would just look away. And on the ships, that was harder, much harder. The Navy ran on routine, on observation, on men knowing each other too well. You slept in hammocks or bunks stacked 3 high, inches apart. You showered in open bays with no stalls, no privacy. You changed clothes in front of each other. You shared toilets, metal bowls in a row, no partitions. There was no alone time, no locked doors, no privacy at all. If you were gay, you learned to be invisible. You learned not to stare. You learned to talk about girls you did not care about, to laugh at jokes you found cruel, to stay quiet when someone used a slur. You learned that survival meant being so careful, so controlled, that you barely felt like yourself. But you also learned to recognize the others. A glance that lasted half a second too long. A guy who never talked about women. A sailor who was too good at spotting the rest of you. On a ship of 300 men, there might be 10 or 15 who were gay. Most of them never acted on it. Too dangerous. But some of them became friends. Close friends. The kind of friendship that looked, to everyone else, like the normal buddy system the Navy encouraged. You watched each other's backs. You stood each other's watches when one of you was sick. You wrote letters home to each other's mothers. And sometimes, late at night, when the ship was dark and the sea was calm and everyone else was asleep, you found a storage room, a quiet corner of the deck, a place where no one would see, and you let yourself be close to someone for 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes. A hand on a shoulder, a whispered confession, a kiss that tasted like salt and fear. Some men took bigger risks. There are documented cases of sailors who fell in love on ship and carried on relationships for months, even years, right under everyone's noses. They passed notes. They invented coded language. One pair of sailors on a destroyer escort in the Atlantic wrote to each other using a shared journal they hid inside a technical manual for the ship's engines. The journal survived. It is in an archive now. The entries are brief, careful, but you can read the love in them. March 12th, 1944. I cannot stop thinking about last night. March 14th. We have to be more careful. March 20th. I do not care anymore. I would rather be caught than never touch you again. They were not caught. They survived the war. But after the war ended, the Navy changed. That fragile, desperate window of tolerance slammed shut. In 1945 and 1946, as the military demobilized, the rate of discharge for homosexuality spiked. Alan Berube found the numbers. Between 1941 and 1945, the Navy discharged roughly 4,000 men for homosexuality. Between 1945 and 1950, they discharged another 9,000. The purge had begun. The military did not need bodies anymore. They needed purity. The discharge process was brutal. If you were accused of being gay, maybe someone reported you, maybe you were caught, maybe you just had the bad luck of being too friendly with the wrong person. You were pulled into an interrogation. Naval Intelligence officers questioned you for hours. They wanted names. They wanted details. They wanted you to confess. If you admitted it, you were given a Section 8 discharge, officially termed undesirable, stamped with a code that every employer in the country could recognize. It was not technically dishonorable, but it might as well have been. The discharge papers followed you everywhere. You could not get a federal job. You could not get a VA loan. In many states, you could not vote. And everyone who saw the papers knew. You were marked. Some men fought it. A sailor named Henry Wigginton was accused in 1945 of having a relationship with another sailor on his ship. The evidence was thin. Someone had seen them sitting too close, talking too quietly, walking together too often. Henry denied it. He demanded a court-martial instead of an administrative discharge because he knew the court-martial had higher evidentiary standards. The Navy tried to pressure him into confessing, into accepting the discharge quietly. He refused. The case went to trial. The prosecutor had no physical evidence, no letters, no witnesses who had actually seen anything sexual, just suspicion. The court acquitted him. Henry was allowed to finish his enlistment and receive an honorable discharge. He wrote about it in a letter to a friend, preserved now in a collection at the New York Public Library. They wanted to ruin me for being careful. I would not let them. Most men, though, did not fight. They were too scared. They took the discharge, went home, and tried to rebuild their lives. Some of them moved to big cities where they could disappear. Some of them married women and buried the truth. Some of them killed themselves. The suicide rate among men discharged for homosexuality during this period is unknown, but anecdotal accounts from veterans suggest it was high. One vet told Berube, "I knew 3 guys from my boot camp platoon who got discharged for being queer. 2 of them were dead within a year." There is a tendency, when we talk about World War II, to frame it as the good war. The war where America saved the world. The war that united the country, that turned boys into men, that built the greatest generation. And in some ways, that is true. But for gay men, the war was more complicated. It was a chance to escape small towns and find each other. It was a chance to discover that they were not alone. But it was also a trap. The same institution that brought them together could destroy them if they were not careful. And after the war, many of them were destroyed anyway. Yet here is the thing historians are still grappling with. Despite all of that, despite the fear and the danger and the discharges and the ruined lives, many gay veterans said later that the war years were the best years of their lives. Not because of the war itself, but because, for the first time, they had lived. They had felt desire. They had fallen in love. They had danced in back rooms and kissed in storage closets and held another man's hand in the dark. And even if it only lasted a few months, even if it ended in heartbreak, even if they never spoke of it again, it had been real. They had been real. One vet, interviewed in the 1980s, said this: "I was 22 years old. I was on a ship in the Pacific. I thought I was going to die. And I met a man who made me feel like I mattered. We never even said the word love. We did not have to. I knew. And that knowing, that feeling, kept me alive through everything that came after." His name was Tom. The man he loved was named Eddie. Eddie died at Okinawa. Tom came home, married a woman, had 3 kids, worked as a school teacher for 40 years. He never told his wife. He never told his kids. But in 1983, when Alan Berube sat down with him in a coffee shop in Seattle, Tom cried. He said, "I have not said his name out loud in 40 years. Eddie. His name was Eddie, and I loved him. I loved him so much." That is what this video is about. Not just policy, not just statistics. Those men, the ones who loved each other when love could cost them everything. The ones who found each other in the chaos of war and held on for as long as they could. The ones whose names were never recorded in any official history, but who lived and loved and mattered. So let us go deeper. Let us talk about what it actually felt like to be a gay sailor in the Pacific in 1944. Let us talk about the daily mechanics of hiding. Let us talk about the language they used, the signals they sent, the risks they took. Let us talk about the cities they vanished into on shore leave, the bars where they danced, the hotel rooms where they finally let themselves breathe. And let us talk about what happened when they came home. The reckoning, the silence, the long decades of pretending. Because all of it matters. Every stolen kiss, every coded letter, every man who loved another man and survived to tell no one. They are all part of this story. And tonight we remember them. The mechanics of hiding started the moment you woke up. 6 in the morning, a bosun's whistle shrieking through the compartment, and you rolled out of your rack trying not to look at anyone too long. You learned that, in the first week, eyes down, eyes forward, never linger. The Navy had a term for the morning routine, revel to muster, and it was designed to strip away privacy. You dressed in a room with 50 other men. You stood in line for the head, shoulder to shoulder, while everyone pissed into a metal trough. You ate breakfast elbow to elbow at long tables bolted to the deck. You were never alone. And if you were gay, you learned to treat every moment like a test you could fail without warning. The uniform helped. Everyone looked the same. White sailor caps, blue wool jumpers in winter, whites in summer, dog tags around your neck, black shoes polished until they reflected light. You disappeared into the uniformity. But the uniformity also meant that any deviation stood out. If you walked differently, talked differently, gestured differently, if you were what they called effeminate, you were marked immediately. The other sailors had 100 slurs for it: pansy, fairy, Nelly, queer. Some of them said it as a joke, some of them said it as a threat. You learned fast which guys were dangerous and which guys were just ignorant. Most gay sailors survived by becoming invisible. You adopted the mannerisms of the men around you. You learned to spit. You learned to swagger. You learned to laugh at the dirty jokes, even when they made you feel sick. You learned to talk about women in graphic, exaggerated terms. The pin-up girls taped inside lockers. The prostitutes in port. The girl back home who was definitely waiting for you even though she was not. You performed masculinity like a role in a play where forgetting your lines meant losing everything. But you also learned to watch, to notice, to recognize the other men who were performing just as hard as you. There was a radar that developed. You could spot another gay man across a crowded mess hall just by the way he held his coffee cup, the way he looked at the guy next to him, the way he laughed half a beat too late at a joke about women. It was not foolproof. Sometimes you were wrong. Sometimes the guy you thought was gay turned out to be the most dangerous kind of straight, the kind who suspected you and wanted to prove it. But most of the time, you were right, and once you recognized each other, you became careful allies. Careful. That is the word that comes up again and again in veteran interviews. You had to be so careful. One sailor, interviewed in the 1990s for an oral history project at the San Francisco Public Library, said this: "You made friends with the other queers, but you never talked about it directly. You never used the word. You just knew. And you looked out for each other. If someone was asking too many questions, you warned each other. If someone was getting too obvious, too careless, you pulled him aside and told him to cool it. Because if one of you got caught, they would come for all of you." The Navy loved a witch hunt. The witch hunts were real. They happened on almost every major base and many ships. Naval Intelligence had officers whose entire job was rooting out homosexuals. They called it maintaining morale and discipline. What it actually meant was interrogations, surveillance, and informants. If a commanding officer suspected there were gay men in his unit, he could request an investigation. NIS, Naval Investigative Service, would send in agents. They would interview sailors one by one. They would ask, "Have you ever engaged in homosexual acts? Do you know anyone who has? Have you seen anything suspicious?" And they would pressure you. If you stayed silent, they accused you of covering for someone. If you named a name, they promised you immunity and then investigated you anyway. The interrogations were designed to break you. They lasted hours. You sat in a windowless room with 2 or 3 officers firing questions. They had files. They had reports. Sometimes they had letters, seized from mail inspections, read without your knowledge, used as evidence. The military censored outgoing mail to prevent classified information from leaking, but the censors also flagged anything that seemed too intimate, too emotional, too queer. If you wrote to another sailor and said something like, "I miss you more than I can say," or "I think about you every night," that letter could end up in an NIS file. And months later, you would find yourself in an interrogation room while an officer read your own words back to you and asked, "What did you mean by this?" Some men confessed. They were exhausted. They were scared. They thought confessing would make it stop. It did not. Once you confessed, the investigators wanted more. They wanted names. Who else? Who were you with? Where did it happen? How many times? They wanted to build a network, to map out every gay man in the unit. And if you gave them names, those men were called in next. The whole thing spread like an infection. One confession could take down a dozen men. In 1943, a witch hunt on the USS Intrepid resulted in 16 sailors being discharged. It started because one sailor was caught with a letter. The letter was from another sailor on the ship. It was not explicit. It just said, "I cannot stop thinking about you," and it was signed with a first name. The recipient panicked and turned it in, trying to deflect suspicion from himself. Naval Intelligence launched an investigation. They interrogated the sender. He gave up 2 names. Those 2 gave up 3 more. Within a month, 16 men were gone. Some of them had never even spoken to each other. They were just connected by rumor, by suspicion, by someone saying, "I think he might be one too." The Intrepid's captain wrote in his report that the morale of the crew had been preserved. What he meant was, "We purged the queers." But here is what the reports never captured. Those 16 men had lives. They had families waiting for them at home. They had futures. And all of it was erased because someone found a letter. One of the discharged sailors, a radio man named Paul Hardman, tried to fight it. He wrote letters to his congressman. He hired a lawyer with money his parents scraped together. He argued that the letter was not evidence of anything, that thinking about someone was not a crime. The lawyer pointed out that the Navy's own regulations required proof of an overt homosexual act, not just suspicion. The appeal went nowhere. The discharge stood. Paul went home to Kansas with an undesirable discharge. He could not get a job. He could not go to college on the GI Bill. His father, a Baptist minister, disowned him. Paul moved to San Francisco in 1947. He lived there for 53 years. He never spoke about the Navy again until a researcher found him in 2000. By then, he was 76 years old, living alone in a studio apartment in the Tenderloin. He agreed to one interview. He said, "They took everything from me because I wrote a letter to a friend. I was 20 years old. I had done nothing wrong, and they destroyed my life." Paul died in 2001. The researcher who interviewed him, a historian named David Johnson, tried to get Paul's discharge upgraded to honorable. The application was denied. The Navy's position was that the regulations at the time were clear and the discharge was lawful. Which was true. It was lawful. But lawful and just are not the same thing. Let me tell you about another sailor. His name was George Matlovich. No relation to Leonard Matlovich, the Air Force sergeant who became a famous gay rights activist in the 1970s. Different man, different war. George enlisted in 1942, right after Pearl Harbor. He was 18, from a small town in Pennsylvania. He had known he was different since he was 12, but he had no language for it. He thought maybe he was sick. Maybe it would go away. The Navy seemed like a good idea, an escape, a chance to prove he was normal, a chance to become the man everyone expected him to be. Boot camp did not fix him. It made it worse. He was surrounded by men, beautiful men, men who stripped down to their skivvies in the barracks at night, who slung arms over each other's shoulders, who wrestled on the grass during downtime. George tried not to look. He failed. He spent 8 weeks in a state of constant low-level panic. And then he graduated and got assigned to a minesweeper in the Atlantic. A minesweeper is a small ship, crew of maybe 80 men. Cramped, dangerous work, sailing ahead of convoys to detonate mines before the bigger ships hit them. George was a gunner's mate. His battle station was a 20mm anti-aircraft gun mounted on the stern. He was good at his job. He kept his head down. He made friends carefully, guys who seemed safe, guys who did not ask too many questions. And for a year, he survived. Then he met Leo. Leo was a cook. He was 25, Italian, from New York. He had dark eyes and a laugh that sounded like it came from somewhere deep and genuine. George noticed him immediately. Everyone noticed Leo. He was the kind of guy who made the galley feel less miserable, who turned powdered eggs into something almost edible, who remembered everyone's birthday and baked cakes out of nothing. George started going to the galley during off hours, ostensibly to grab coffee, actually just to be near Leo. They talked. About home, About food. About everything except the thing they were both thinking. One night, 3 months in, the ship was docked in a port in North Africa. Most of the crew went ashore. George stayed behind. He was on duty. Leo stayed too. He said he was tired. They ended up in the galley together, late, the ship quiet, except for the creak of metal and the slap of water against the hull. Leo made coffee. They sat across from each other at the steel prep table, and Leo said, "You know, right?" George's heart stopped. He said, "Know what?" Leo said, "About me." George stared at him. Leo smiled, not a nervous smile, a sad one. He said, "It is okay. I know about you too." They did not touch that night. They just talked, for hours. Leo told George about New York, about the bars in Greenwich Village, about a whole world George had never imagined. A world where men like them could exist, could meet each other, could live. George cried. He had never cried in front of anyone since he was a kid. Leo reached across the table and put his hand over George's. He said, "You are not alone." They were together for the next 18 months. Not openly, not even close to openly, but together. They engineered their schedules so their off-duty hours overlapped. They found places on the ship where no one went, storage rooms, maintenance shafts, the bilge once when they were desperate. They wrote notes and hid them in each other's bunks. They developed a code. If Leo left a fork on the left side of George's plate at dinner, it meant, "Meet me at midnight." If George left his coffee cup on the galley counter instead of the sink, it meant, "Not tonight." Too risky. It was not a life. It was stolen moments, but it was enough. George said later, much later, in an interview recorded in 1989, a year before he died, he said, "Those 18 months were the only time in my entire life I felt like I was supposed to feel, like I was whole, like I mattered to someone." It ended because the war ended. The ship was decommissioned in 1945. The crew was reassigned. George went to a destroyer. Leo went to a supply depot in California. They had one night together before they separated. They went to a bar in Norfolk, Virginia. The bar was not explicitly a gay bar, but it was known. Sailors went there. You could tell who was looking and who was not. George and Leo sat in a back booth and drank whiskey neither of them liked. They did not talk much. What was there to say? They could not promise to stay in touch. Too dangerous. They could not make plans. What plans could they make? The military owned them. So they just sat there, shoulders touching, and tried to memorize what it felt like to be next to each other. Leo said, "I will never forget you." George said, "I will never forgive the world for this." They walked back to base separately. George never saw him again. He tried to find him after the war. He wrote letters to the address Leo had given him, a cousin's apartment in Brooklyn. The letters came back undeliverable. George did not know if Leo had moved, or if the cousin had thrown the letters away, or if something worse had happened. He never found out. George went home to Pennsylvania. He got a job at a steel mill. He lived with his parents for 2 years, then moved into a boarding house. He never married. People asked why. He said he had never met the right girl. In 1989, when a researcher from the University of Pittsburgh contacted him about the Oral History Project, George was 65. He had lived alone for 40 years. He agreed to the interview on one condition, that it would not be published until after he died. He said, "I do not want my family to know. Let me die with the secret. Then you can tell whoever you want." He died in 1990. The interview was published in 1992. His niece read it. She called the researcher and said, "I wish he had told us. We would have loved him anyway. Maybe, maybe not." But George never took that chance. And neither did tens of thousands of other men who came home from the war and buried the truth so deep, they almost convinced themselves it had never happened. Not everyone buried it. Some men came home and ran straight toward the gay world they had glimpsed during the war. The cities that had swelled with servicemen during the war did not shrink back to nothing when the war ended. The gay bars stayed open, the networks stayed intact. And a generation of veterans who had learned they were not alone flooded into those cities looking for each other. San Francisco became the obvious destination. It had always had a gay community, but the war supercharged it. Hundreds of thousands of servicemen had passed through San Francisco on their way to the Pacific. Some of them had stayed, some of them had come back after discharge. The city had jobs, shipyards, docks, rebuilding industries. It had cheap rent. It had bars where men met men, and it had a critical mass. Enough gay men that you could build a life, not an open life, not yet, but a life where you were not the only one. The Black Cat Cafe on Montgomery Street became legendary. It had been around since before the war, but in the late 1940s, it became the center of gay San Francisco. The owner, Sol Stuman, did not care who you were as long as you paid for your drinks. The bartenders were gay. The entertainers were drag performers and opera singers. On weekends, the place was packed. Sailors in uniform, guys just out of the service, men who worked in offices during the week and became themselves on Saturday nights. The police raided it constantly. Sol fought back. In 1951, the city tried to revoke his liquor license on the grounds that the bar attracted homosexuals and other undesirables. Sol sued. He argued that there was no law against serving gay people, that the bar was not disorderly, that the police were harassing his customers without cause. He won. The California Supreme Court ruled in his favor in 1951. It was one of the first legal victories for gay rights in American history, and it happened because a straight bar owner refused to back down. The Black Cat stayed open until 1963. Thousands of men walked through those doors. Some of them were veterans. Some of them had been dishonorably discharged and had nowhere else to go. Some of them had honorable discharges and good jobs and secret lives. They all came to the Black Cat because it was the one place they could be honest. A veteran named Arthur Miller, no relation to the playwright, told a researcher in 1995, "I walked into the Black Cat in 1947 and I saw two men kissing at the bar. I almost turned around and walked out. I thought it was a trap, but then I saw that no one cared. The bartender was pouring drinks, people were laughing, and I thought, this is real. This exists. I stayed until closing. I came back every weekend for the next 10 years. Arthur had been discharged in 1946 with an undesirable discharge after being caught with another sailor in a hotel room in Hawaii. He had no GI benefits. He had no job prospects. He had taken a bus from Ohio to San Francisco with $200 in his pocket and no plan. The Black Cat saved his life. He met other veterans there. They helped each other. Someone knew a guy who was hiring at the docks. Someone else had a spare room. Someone else knew a lawyer who could help you navigate the discharge paperwork if you wanted to appeal. It was a network, a chosen family, the thing that gay people have always built when the world pushes them out. New York had its own geography. Greenwich Village had been a gay neighborhood since the 1920s, but after the war, it exploded. The bars had names like the Howdy Club, Mary's, the Bagatelle. They were not exclusively gay, that was illegal, but everyone knew. The police raided them regularly. If you were in a bar when the cops walked in, you had two choices: run or stay. If you ran, they chased you. If you stayed, they checked your ID, wrote down your name, and sometimes arrested you for disorderly conduct. Either way, your name ended up in a police file. And if you were a veteran with a questionable discharge, that file could follow you. But the bars stayed full. Because where else were you supposed to go? A veteran named William Edwards told an interviewer in 1981, "I got out of the Navy in 1945. I went home to Georgia. I lasted 6 months. I could not breathe there. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone watched everyone. I got on a bus to New York and never went back. I lived in a 4th floor walk-up with 2 other guys, both vets. We went to the bars every weekend. The cops raided us 3 times. I got arrested once. I spent a night in jail. I went right back the next weekend. Because it was worth it. To be in a room with 100 men who were like me, to dance, to laugh, to not have to pretend for a few hours, it was worth anything." The historian George Chauncey documented this world in his work on New York's gay community. He found arrest records, bar licenses, police reports. Between 1945 and 1950, the NYPD arrested roughly 5,000 men on charges related to homosexuality. Some of them were arrested for solicitation, some for disorderly conduct, some just for being in the wrong place when the cops decided to make their quota. Many of them were veterans. Chauncey found that in the late 1940s, a significant portion of the men arrested in gay bar raids were wearing military uniforms or had military IDs. They were men who had just gotten out, who had not yet transitioned to civilian life, who were still holding on to the one identity that had given them structure, and the city was arresting them for being gay. Some of them fought back. In 1948, a sailor named John Richmond was arrested in a bar in the village. He had been discharged 6 months earlier with an honorable discharge. He was still wearing his navy dress blues because he did not have money for civilian clothes yet. The cops raided the bar, arrested 15 men, and charged them all with disorderly conduct. John pled not guilty. He argued that he had been sitting quietly at the bar, drinking a beer, talking to no one. The prosecutor said his presence in a known homosexual establishment was itself disorderly. The judge agreed. John was fined $50. He refused to pay. He filed an appeal. The appeal went nowhere, but John wrote letters to the Navy Department, to his congressman, to anyone who would listen. He wrote, "I served my country for 3 years. I fought in the Pacific. I have an honorable discharge, and now I am being punished for sitting in a bar. This is not justice." No one wrote back. John gave up. He paid the fine. He moved to California a year later, but his letters survived. They are in the National Archives now, in a file labeled Complaints, Miscellaneous. A researcher found them in 2003. She wrote a paper about John Richmond, trying to track him down. She never found him, but his words are there, and they matter. This is what it was like to come home from World War II as a gay man. You had survived the war. You had survived the military. You had found moments of love, of connection, of feeling like you were not alone. And then you came home, and the country told you that love was a crime, that you were a criminal, that the same uniform you had worn with pride now marked you as suspect, that the men you had fought beside would turn on you if they knew the truth. So you learned to hide again. You learned to lie again. You learned to pretend again. Or you ran. To the cities. To the bars. To the only places where you could exhale. And some men did not survive that transition. The suicide rate among gay veterans in the years immediately after World War II is something historians are still trying to quantify. The data is incomplete. Suicide was stigmatized. Families hid it. Coroners wrote other causes of death. But the oral histories are full of stories. A friend who disappeared. A bunkmate who came home and 3 months later was dead. A lover who could not take the silence anymore. One veteran told Alan Baroob, "I knew 8 gay guys from my ship. By 1950, 3 of them were dead. 2 suicides. 1 killed in a bar fight. 1 just gone. No one knew what happened. We were kids. We survived the war. And we could not survive the peace." That is the weight of it. That is what needs to be said. Because the story of gay sailors in World War II is not just a story about bravery, about stolen kisses and secret love. It is also a story about what happened after, about the men who came home and had to bury the best parts of themselves just to survive, about the men who were discharged and destroyed, about the men who never got to be themselves again, about the men who died because living was too hard. But it is also a story about resilience, about the men who made it, who built lives in the margins, who found each other, who created communities out of nothing, who refused to disappear even when the world wanted them to. The resilience looked different for every man. For some, it meant marriage, a performance of normalcy that could protect you from suspicion. You married a woman. You had children. You built a life that looked, from the outside, exactly like everyone else's. And maybe you loved your wife in your own way. Maybe you were a good father. Maybe you buried the truth so deep that whole years went by without thinking about the sailor you kissed in a storage room in 1944. Or maybe you thought about him every single day and learned to live with the ache. A sailor named Donald Vining kept a diary. He started it before the war and continued it until his death in 1998. The diary is thousands of pages long. It is one of the most detailed accounts of a gay man's life in mid-20th century America. Donald was drafted into the Navy in 1942. He was assigned to a supply depot in New York. He spent the war handling paperwork, inventory, shipments, unglamorous work, but it kept him stateside, and it put him in New York, which meant access to the gay world in the village. Donald went to the bars, he went to the piers, he met men, he had relationships, some brief, some longer. He wrote about all of it in his diary. The entries are remarkably candid. He wrote about sex, he wrote about love, he wrote about fear. In one entry from 1943, he wrote, "Went to Mary's last night, met a sailor named Eddie. We talked for 2 hours. He told me about his ship. I told him about nothing because I have nothing to tell. He is shipping out next week. We went back to his hotel. I do not think I will see him again. I do not think he wants to. But for one night, I felt like someone wanted me. That is enough. It has to be enough." Donald survived the war. He was discharged in 1946 with an honorable discharge. He went back to civilian life. He worked in publishing. He never married. He had long-term relationships with men, but he kept them private. His family never knew. His co-workers never knew. He lived a double life for 50 years, but he also lived honestly in his diary. He documented everything. And when he died, he left instructions that the diary should be donated to the New York Public Library. He wanted it preserved. He wanted people to know. The historian Martin Duberman has written about the significance of Donald Vining's diary. He called it one of the most important primary sources we have for understanding gay life in this period. Because Donald was not famous, he was not an activist. He was just a man who lived through a difficult time and wrote it down. And now we have his voice. We know what it felt like. We know what he risked. We know that he existed. Other men survived through community. They found each other and held on. In San Francisco, a group of gay veterans started meeting informally in the late 1940s. They called themselves the Boys. No official organization, no charter. Just a group of men who had served, who had been discharged or who had made it through with honorable papers, who needed each other. They met at someone's apartment every month. They cooked dinner together. They played cards. They talked about jobs, about dates, about the war, about the men they had lost. It was the first gay veterans group in American history, though no one called it that. It was just, "Do you want to come over on Saturday? Bring a bottle if you can." One of the men in that group was named James Kepner. He had been a Navy radioman during the war. He was discharged in 1945 and stayed in Los Angeles. In the 1950s, he became one of the earliest gay rights activists in the country. He helped found One, Inc., one of the first gay rights organizations in America. He started collecting gay history, books, articles, letters, anything he could find. That collection became the One National Gay and Lesbian Archives, which still exists today. James spent his entire adult life preserving the history that the rest of the world wanted to erase. And it started in that apartment in San Francisco, with a bunch of veterans eating spaghetti and talking about the men they used to be. James wrote about the importance of those gatherings. He said, "We were not political yet. We did not have the language for activism, but we had each other. And that was radical, just existing together, just refusing to be ashamed. That was the beginning. But surviving also meant navigating a country that was becoming more hostile, not less." The late 1940s and early 1950s saw the rise of what historians call the Lavender Scare. It ran parallel to the Red Scare, the hunt for communists, but it targeted gay people. The logic was that homosexuals were security risks. They could be blackmailed. They were morally weak. They were a threat to American values, Politicians gave speeches about the homosexual menace. Congressional committees launched investigations. Federal agencies purged their staffs. Between 1947 and 1961, the federal government fired more than 5,000 employees for being gay or suspected of being gay. State governments followed suit. Private companies followed suit. If you were outed, you lost your job. You lost your reputation. You lost everything. Veterans were especially vulnerable. If you had been discharged for homosexuality, that information was in your file, and employers could request military records. A blue discharge, undesirable, was a red flag. Most men with blue discharges lied. They said they had been discharged for medical reasons, for family hardship, for anything other than the truth. Some of them got away with it. Some of them did not. A veteran named Carl Whitman had a blue discharge. He had been caught with another sailor in 1945. He was 21. He went home to Iowa. He could not get a job. Every application asked for military service history. Every employer requested his discharge papers. Carl lied on the applications. He said he had an honorable discharge. But when the papers came back, the employers saw the truth. He was turned away again and again. He tried for a year. Finally, he gave up. He moved to Chicago. He worked under the table, dishwashing, hauling freight, anything that paid cash and did not ask questions. He lived in a boarding house with 6 other men. He shared a bathroom. He ate 1 meal a day. He wrote letters to the Navy Department asking for his discharge to be upgraded. He wrote to his congressman. He wrote to veterans organizations. No one helped. In 1952, Carl killed himself. He was 28 years old. He left a note. The note was 1 sentence long. I cannot do this anymore. His landlord found him. The landlord called Carl's parents. They came to Chicago to collect the body. They found the letters Carl had written, dozens of them, drafts and copies, pleading for help. His mother burned them. She told the family Carl had died in an accident. No one in Iowa ever knew the truth. Carl's story is not unique. It is not even unusual. There are hundreds of stories like his. Thousands, probably. Men who came home from the war and could not survive what came after. Men who were discharged and destroyed. Men who chose death over the weight of shame. Their names are not in any official record. Their deaths were not marked as casualties of the war. But they were. Let me tell you about one more man. His name was Randy Shilts. Wait. No. Wrong generation. Randy Shilts was the journalist who documented the AIDS crisis. Let me start again. His name was Frank Kameny. He was not a sailor. He was an astronomer. But his story connects to this because Frank was one of the men who fought back. Frank was drafted into the army in 1943. He served for 2 years. He was discharged honorably in 1945. He went to Harvard. He got a PhD in astronomy. In 1957, he was hired by the Army Map Service, a federal agency. It was a dream job. He had security clearance. He was doing research he loved. And then, 4 months in, he was called into an office and asked, "Are you a homosexual?" Frank was honest. He said yes. He was fired immediately. His security clearance was revoked. He was blacklisted from federal employment. He could not get another job in his field. His career was over. Most men would have given up. Frank did not. He decided to fight. He appealed his firing. The appeal was denied. He appealed again. Denied. He took his case all the way to the Supreme Court. The court refused to hear it. So Frank did something no one had done before. He became an activist. He co-founded the Mattachine Society of Washington, one of the first gay rights organizations in the country. He started picketing the White House. He started arguing that gay people deserved equal rights under the law. He spent the rest of his life fighting the same system that had destroyed so many men like him. Frank was not a veteran of the Navy, but he was part of the same generation, the generation of men who had served their country and been punished for who they were. And his fight, his refusal to accept that punishment, paved the way for every gay rights victory that came after. When the military finally lifted the ban on gay service members in 2011, Frank was still alive. He was 86. He had spent 50 years fighting for that moment. And when it happened, he said, "It is about time, and it is not enough, but it is a start." Frank died in 2011, a few months after the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. His funeral was held in Washington. Hundreds of people came. Many of them were veterans. Many of them were men who had been discharged for being gay and had spent decades fighting for their discharges to be upgraded. They stood in that room and they honored Frank because he had fought for them when no one else would. But here is the thing. Frank had the education, the resources, the privilege to fight. Most men did not. Most men just tried to survive. They took the jobs they could get. They hid who they were. They lived quiet lives in the margins. And they died without anyone knowing what they had endured. Let us go back to the ships, because surviving also meant surviving on board, in real time, during the war. Let us talk about the daily strategies, the small rituals of self-protection. You learn to sleep in a certain position. On your side, facing the bulkhead, never on your back. Because if you slept on your back, you might have a dream. And if you had a dream, you might wake up with an erection. And if someone saw that and made a joke, you had to laugh and make a joke back. And you had to do it immediately, without hesitation, because any pause could be read as guilt. You learned to shower fast, eyes down, in and out. You soaped up and rinsed off in under 2 minutes. You never stayed in the shower longer than you had to because staying too long meant you were looking. And if someone accused you of looking, you could not defend yourself. Denial was evidence. Everyone knew that queers always denied it. You learned to talk about women constantly. You kept a pin-up in your locker. Betty Grable, Rita Hayworth, someone wholesome and safe. You talked about what you would do to her if you ever met her. You made it graphic. The other guys did the same. It was a script everyone performed, and you performed it better than anyone because you had to. You learned to avoid certain men, the ones who were too friendly, the ones who smiled too much, the ones who touched your shoulder when they talked, not because you did not like them, but because being seen with them too often meant you were one of them. Guilt by association. So you kept your distance. You were polite but cold. And sometimes you saw the hurt in their eyes, and you hated yourself for it. But you did it anyway because survival came first. You learned which guys were dangerous. The ones who made a sport of hunting queers. Every ship had at least one, usually more. They watched, they listened, they set traps. They would sit near you in the mess and talk about fairies and see how you reacted. They would ask casual questions. Hey, you got a girl back home? And if you hesitated, if you stumbled, they remembered. They spread rumors. They started whisper campaigns. And once a rumor started, it was almost impossible to stop. A sailor named Vincent Lopez wrote about this in a letter he sent to a gay magazine in 1967. The letter was published anonymously, but Vincent's name was later confirmed by a researcher who tracked him down in the 1990s. Vincent had served on a submarine tender in the Pacific. He wrote, "There was a guy on my ship who made it his mission to out every queer he could find. He kept a list. I saw it once. It had names, dates, things guys had supposedly said or done. He showed it to the chief. 3 men got discharged because of that list. I was terrified my name would end up on it. I avoided that guy like he was death, because he was. The man with the list was never punished. He was never reprimanded. He was doing the Navy's work for them, rooting out the perverts, keeping the crew clean. When the war ended, he got an honorable discharge and a commendation. But you also learned to find the safe people, the guys who knew and did not care, the ones who had a gay brother or a gay uncle, or who had grown up in a city and had seen enough to know that not everyone fit the mold. These men were rare, but they existed. And when you found one, you held on. They became your cover, your alibi, your protection. If someone asked why you were spending so much time with so-and-so, you had a straight friend who could vouch for you, who could say, "He is a good guy, leave him alone." One veteran told an interviewer, "I had a buddy on my ship. Big guy, from Texas, tough as nails. He figured out I was queer about 3 months in. I thought I was done. But he pulled me aside one day and said, "I do not care. My brother is like you. Just be careful. He is the reason I survived." Every time someone started talking shit, he shut it down. Every time I got nervous, he reminded me to play it cool. I owed him my life. After the war, we stayed in touch for a few years. Then we lost contact. I hope he is okay. I hope he knows what he did for me. That kind of quiet decency saved lives. It did not make headlines. It was not part of the official record. But it mattered. Every gay sailor who made it through the war had at least one person like that. Someone who knew or suspected and chose kindness over cruelty. Those people are part of this story too. Now let us talk about shore leave again. Because shore leave was not just about the bars, it was also about sex. Let me be very clear. The sex happened. It was not all romance and longing and coded letters. Sometimes it was just physical. Two men finding a dark alley, a park, a hotel room, and having sex because they needed it, because they had been at sea for months, because they might die tomorrow, and this was the only chance they would get. The ports had districts. Every sailor knew where to go. In San Francisco, it was the Embarcadero and certain blocks of North Beach. In Honolulu, it was side streets off Hotel Street. In New York, it was the piers and the parks. In Norfolk, it was Ocean View. These were not explicitly gay spaces. They were just places where men went. And if you knew how to look, you could tell who was cruising and who was not. Cruising is the term. It meant walking slowly, making eye contact, waiting to see if the eye contact was returned. If it was, you followed. You walked together without speaking. You found a place. You did what you came to do. Then you left. No names, no promises. Just the thing itself. It sounds cold. Maybe it was, but it was also survival. For many men, those encounters were the only time they got to express their desire in a physical way. The only time they got to be touched by another man without pretending it was something else. And for some of them, that was enough. It had to be. There were risks, plenty of risks. The shore patrol walked those areas constantly. If they caught you, you were arrested. If you were arrested, you were court-martialed. If you were court-martialed, you were discharged and possibly imprisoned. The risk was always there. But men took it anyway, because the need was stronger than the fear. Some men got rolled. Rolled means robbed. There were civilians who targeted gay servicemen because they knew those men could not report the crime. You meet a guy, you go somewhere private, and suddenly there are two other guys and they are taking your wallet, your watch, your Liberty Pass. Maybe they beat you up. Maybe they just threaten to report you to the shore patrol unless you give them everything you have. Either way, you lose. And you stay silent because what are you going to do? File a report? Admit you were cruising? A sailor named Eugene Thompson was rolled in 1944. He was on leave in San Diego. He met a man at a bar. They went to a hotel. The man's friends were waiting. They took everything. They beat Eugene badly enough that he had to go to the infirmary when he got back to base. The medic asked what happened. Eugene said he had been mugged. The medic did not believe him. He wrote it up as suspicious. Naval Intelligence questioned Eugene. He stuck to his story. They did not have evidence to charge him, but they flagged his file. 2 years later, when Eugene applied for a promotion, the flag came up. He was passed over. He never made rank. He stayed a seaman second class for the rest of his enlistment. He was discharged in 1946. Honorable, technically. But his career had been stalled by a suspicion no one ever proved. Eugene moved to Los Angeles after the war. He worked in a factory. He married a woman in 1950. They had 2 kids. He never told his wife. He never told anyone. In 1998, a researcher doing oral histories found Eugene's name in a list of veterans who had been flagged by NIS. The researcher contacted him. Eugene was 76. He agreed to talk, but only off the record. He said, "I am too old to care what people think, but my family does not know. Let them keep not knowing. When I am dead, you can say whatever you want." Eugene died in 2002. The researcher published his story in 2005. Eugene's son read it. The son wrote a letter to the researcher. He said, "I wish my father had trusted me. I wish he had known I would not have judged him. But I understand why he did not. The world he lived in did not allow for trust. That is the generational wound. That is what we are still healing from. An entire generation of men who lived in silence because silence was the only option. And their children, their families, left wondering what else they did not know. What other truths were buried? Some men found love on shore leave. Real love, not just cruising. They met someone in a bar. They went on dates. They wrote letters. They tried to build something that could last longer than a weekend pass. It almost never worked. The military moved you constantly. You got new orders. You shipped out. You lost contact. But some men tried anyway. A sailor named Bernard Gorman met a man named Peter in Seattle in 1943. Bernard was on a 2-week leave before his ship headed to the Aleutians. Peter was a civilian, a clerk at a department store. They met at a bar. They spent the next 12 days together. They went to movies. They walked along the waterfront. They had dinner at Peter's apartment. They talked about what it would be like if the war ended, if they could live together, if the world were different. They knew it was fantasy, but they let themselves imagine it anyway. Bernard shipped out. He wrote to Peter every week. Peter wrote back. The letters were careful. Nothing explicit. Just, "I miss you. I think about you. I hope you are safe." They kept writing for 2 years, and then Bernard's ship was hit by a kamikaze off Okinawa. Bernard survived. Barely. He spent 6 months in a hospital in Hawaii. When he finally got back to the States, he went to Seattle. He found Peter's address. He knocked on the door. Peter opened the door. He stared at Bernard, and then he stepped outside and closed the door behind him. He said, "You cannot be here." Bernard said, "I came back for you." Peter said, "I am married now. I have a wife. You have to go." Bernard left. He never contacted Peter again. He told this story to a researcher in 1987. He said, "I thought we had something real. Maybe we did. But real was not enough. The world did not let us have real." Bernard went back to his hometown in Massachusetts. He lived with his parents for a year while he figured out what to do next. The Navy had given him a medical discharge. Honorable, with a small disability pension for the injuries from the kamikaze strike. He had shrapnel scars across his back and a limp he would carry for the rest of his life. But those were the visible wounds. The invisible ones were harder to explain. He could not tell his parents why he barely slept, why he flinched at loud noises, why he spent hours staring out the window at nothing. His mother assumed it was shell shock. She was half right. The war had broken something in him, but so had coming home to find that the one person he had survived for had moved on. Bernard eventually moved to Boston. He got a job as a bookkeeper. He lived alone in a studio apartment in the South End, which was starting to become known as a neighborhood where men like him could live quietly. He went to the bars sometimes, the Napoleon Club, the Sail Away. He met men. He had brief relationships. Nothing stuck. He told the researcher in 1987, "I kept looking for Peter in every man I met. I never found him. After a while, I stopped looking. I just lived. I went to work. I came home. I read books. I listened to the radio. It was not a bad life. It was not the life I wanted, but it was the one I had." Bernard died in 1991. He was 71. He left his papers to the Boston Public Library. Among them was a shoebox full of letters. Every letter Peter had written to him during the war. Bernard had kept them for 46 years. On the inside of the shoebox lid, he had written in faded ink, "The only evidence that I was ever loved." The question that haunts this history is, how many? How many gay sailors served during World War II? We will never know the real number. The military did not track it systematically until the discharges started ramping up in 1945. The Kinsey reports, published in 1948 and 1953, suggested that roughly 10% of men had substantial homosexual experience. If you apply that percentage to the 4 million men who served in the Navy and Coast Guard during the war, you get 400,000. 400,000 gay and bisexual sailors. That is a conservative estimate. Some historians think the number was higher because the military, by its very nature, selected for young, unmarried men, the demographic most likely to explore same-sex desire. 400,000 men. Think about that. 400,000 men who served their country while hiding a fundamental part of who they were. 400,000 men who stood watch, loaded guns, swabbed decks, launched planes, fought battles, saved lives, won a war, all while knowing that if the truth came out, they would be erased. 400,000 men whose stories were never told because telling them was too dangerous. Most of them took the secret to their graves, but some of them left clues. A photograph tucked into a Bible, a letter hidden in an attic, a diary entry that said more than it should have. And decades later, researchers found those clues and started piecing the story together. The work is ongoing. There are still archives that have not been fully explored. There are still families who have shoeboxes in their basements, full of letters they have never read. There are still men, very few now, but some, who are still alive, still silent, still carrying the weight. In 2016, a veteran named Ed Butts gave an interview to a local newspaper in Oregon. Ed was 93. He had served on a destroyer in the Pacific. He had never spoken publicly about being gay. But his partner of 40 years had died the year before, and Ed decided he was done hiding. He told the reporter, "I am 93 years old. Everyone I was ever afraid of is dead. So here is the truth. I am gay. I have been gay my whole life. I fell in love with a man on my ship in 1944. His name was Charlie. We were together for 6 months before he was killed at Leyte Gulf. I never got over him. I tried. I met other men. I built a life. But he was the first. And you never forget the first." The reporter asked if Ed had any photographs of Charlie. Ed said no. He said, "We did not take pictures together. That would have been evidence. But I remember his face. I remember everything about him. The way he laughed. The way he looked at me when no one else was watching. The way he said my name. I've carried him with me for 72 years. And now, I am telling you. So someone knows. So it is not just me anymore." Ed died 6 months after that interview. The newspaper ran his obituary. It mentioned his service. It mentioned his partner. It mentioned Charlie. It was the first time Charlie's name had appeared in print. 72 years after his death, someone finally said, "He existed. He mattered. He was loved." That is what this work is about. Finding the names, saying them out loud, refusing to let them be forgotten. Let me tell you about the language, because one of the hardest parts of understanding this history is that the men themselves did not have the language we have now. The word gay did not become widely used as an identity term until the 1960s. Before that, the most common terms were homosexual, which was clinical and medical, or the slurs, queer, fairy, pansy, fruit. Most men did not use any of those words to describe themselves. They just knew they were different. They knew they were attracted to men, but they had no framework for it, no community, no identity, just a feeling they could not name and could not share. Some men used code words. Temperamental was one. If someone said a guy was temperamental, it might mean he was gay. So was artistic. So was sensitive. These were signals, ways of communicating without saying the thing directly. A sailor might say, "I think Jim is temperamental." And if the person he was talking to understood the code, they might say, "Yeah, I got that sense too." And just like that, two gay men had identified each other without ever using the word. There were also phrases. A friend of Dorothy was one, though that did not become widespread until later. In the Navy, some men used seafaring metaphors. A sailor might say, someone sailed on the other side, meaning he was gay. Or he is in the life, meaning he was part of the underground gay world. These phrases were subtle enough that straight sailors would not catch them, but clear enough that other gay men would. And then there were the looks, the glances, the double takes. You learned to read a room in seconds. You walked into the mess and you scanned faces. Who looked at you too long? Who looked away too fast? Who smiled when your eyes met? You built a mental map of who was safe, who was dangerous, and who might be like you. It was exhausting, but it kept you alive. The historian Alan Berube interviewed a veteran named Harvey Milk. Yes, that Harvey Milk. Before he became the first openly gay elected official in California, before he was assassinated in 1978, Harvey Milk was a Navy sailor. He enlisted in 1951 during the Korean War, but his story connects to the World War II generation because he came of age in the same military culture. Harvey served on a submarine rescue ship. He was a diving officer. He was good at his job. He was also gay, though he was not open about it. He had relationships with other sailors, discreetly, carefully. He was never caught. He received an honorable discharge in 1955. Years later, when Harvey was campaigning for office in San Francisco, he talked about his time in the Navy. He said, "The military taught me how to hide. It taught me how to read people. It taught me how to survive in a hostile environment. Those skills saved my life later, but they also made me angry, because I should not have had to learn them. No one should have to learn how to hide who they are just to survive." Harvey was killed in 1978. He was 48. His death devastated the gay community, but his legacy lived on. And part of that legacy is the story of the gay sailors who came before him, the men who served in World War II and Korea and Vietnam, the men who hid and survived, the men whose skills at deception were not weaknesses but survival strategies, the men who learned to navigate a world that wanted them dead. Now let us talk about the women, because this is a script about gay sailors, about men who loved men, but we cannot ignore the women who were part of this world. The Navy had women too. The WWIIs, women accepted for volunteer emergency service, were established in 1942. By the end of the war, 86,000 women had served in the WWIIs. They worked as clerks, radiomen, air traffic controllers, cryptologists. They were not allowed on combat ships, but they were essential to the war effort. And some of them were lesbians. The same dynamics that brought gay men together brought lesbian women together. Suddenly you were living in barracks with dozens of other women. You were away from home, away from the expectation that you would marry and have children. You were doing work that mattered. You were independent. And if you were a lesbian, you were surrounded by other women, some of whom were like you. The military was just as hostile to lesbians as it was to gay men, maybe more so. Women were already suspect in the military, seen as temporary, as filling in until the men came home. Lesbians were doubly suspect. They were accused of being masculine, of trying to be men, of corrupting other women. The investigations were brutal. If a woman was accused of being a lesbian, she was interrogated, pressured to name names, and discharged. Often the accusation was enough. You did not have to be caught doing anything. You just had to be suspected. But lesbians also built networks. They found each other. They protected each other. And after the war, many of them stayed in the cities where they had been stationed. They became part of the lesbian bar culture that exploded in the 1950s and 60s. San Francisco, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago. These cities had lesbian bars where women who had served in the military gathered. They shared stories. They talked about the women they had loved during the war. They mourned the women who had been discharged, disappeared, lost. One of those women was a WWII named Pat Bond. Pat served from 1945 to 1946. She was stationed in Washington, D.C. She worked in an office handling personnel files. She was a lesbian, though she did not have that word yet. She just knew she was attracted to women. She met another wave named Marie. They fell in love. They were together for 8 months. They were careful. They did not hold hands in public. They did not dance together at the dances the Navy organized. They met in Marie's room late at night, after everyone else was asleep. They whispered promises they both knew they could not keep. In 1946, someone reported them. Pat never found out who. Maybe someone had seen them together. Maybe someone had read a letter. Maybe someone just suspected. The investigation was fast. Both women were called in separately. Both were interrogated. Both denied everything. It did not matter. They were both discharged. Undesirable discharges. Their military service erased. Pat went home to Iowa. She lasted 6 months. She could not get a job. Her discharge papers followed her everywhere. She moved to San Francisco. She worked as a waitress. She found the lesbian bars. She met other women who had been discharged. She found community. And in the 1970s, when the gay rights movement started, Pat became an activist. She performed in gay theater. She spoke at rallies. She told her story publicly. She said, "They tried to erase me. They failed. I am still here." Pat died in 1990. Her funeral was held in San Francisco. Hundreds of women came. Many of them were veterans. Many of them had been discharged for being lesbians. They stood together and they honored Pat because she had refused to stay silent, because she had fought back, because she had survived. The stories of lesbian veterans and gay male veterans are parallel but not identical. Women faced different kinds of scrutiny. They were policed differently. They were punished differently. But they faced the same underlying hostility, the same demand that they hide who they were, the same threat of erasure. And many of them, like Pat, like the women in the bars, like the women who built lives in the margins, refused to be erased. But let us return to the men. Let us return to the ships, because there is another layer to this story that we have not fully explored yet. The relationships that lasted. The men who found each other during the war and stayed together after. These stories are rare. Most relationships ended when the war ended, but some did not. A sailor named Harold Norris met a man named Louis Gant in 1943. Both were stationed at a naval base in Rhode Island. Harold was a yeoman, a clerk. Louis was a cook. They met in the mess hall. Louis made a joke about the powdered eggs. Harold laughed. They started talking. They became friends, then more than friends. They were together for the rest of the war. They were careful. They never wrote letters to each other. Too risky. They just found moments. A walk along the seawall after dinner. A shared cigarette behind the supply shed. A stolen hour in a storage room when everyone else was on liberty. When the war ended, they both received honorable discharges. They went home to different states. Harold went to Pennsylvania. Louis went to North Carolina. They thought that was it. They thought they would never see each other again. But 6 months later, Louis showed up at Harold's door. He had taken a bus for 20 hours. He said, "I cannot do this. I cannot pretend you did not happen." Harold said, "Then do not." They moved to Philadelphia together. They told people they were cousins. No one questioned it. They got an apartment. They got jobs. They lived together for 53 years. They were never able to marry. They were never able to be open. But they built a life. They had friends who knew. They went to the bars. They were part of the community. And when Harold died in 1998, Louis held his hand. The hospital staff thought Louis was Harold's brother. Louis did not correct them. He just sat there and held the hand of the man he had loved for 53 years and said goodbye. Louis died 2 years later. He left instructions that he wanted to be buried next to Harold. The cemetery said no. They said Harold's plot was a single plot, family only. Louis's niece fought them. She told them the truth. She said, they were together for 53 years. They loved each other. They deserved to be together. The cemetery refused. So Louis's niece had Harold's body moved. She bought a new plot in a different cemetery. She buried them side by side. The headstones say, Harold Norris, 1922-1998. beloved. Lewis Gant, 1921-2000. Beloved. That is it. Just beloved. But anyone who knows the story knows what it means. There are other stories like this. Not many, but some. The historian Alan Berube estimated that perhaps 5% of gay sailors who met during the war managed to stay together afterward. 5%. That is 20,000 men out of 400,000. 20,000 men who built lives together, who survived the war and survived the peace, who refused to let go. Most of their stories are lost, but some of them were documented. Some of them left traces. Some of them had nieces who fought cemeteries. And now we know. Let me tell you about another strategy for survival. The letters. Some men did write to each other after the war. They had to be careful. They used coded language. They wrote as friends, as buddies, as shipmates who missed each other. But if you read the letters closely, you can see the love underneath. You can see the longing. A collection of letters between two sailors, identified only as R and J, was donated to the LGBTQ History Museum in San Francisco in 2004. The letters span from 1946 to 1953. They are heartbreaking. R lived in Texas. J lived in California. They had served together on a cruiser in the Pacific. They had been lovers during the war. After the war, they tried to stay in touch. The letters are full of coded phrases. I think about our time in the service often. I miss the camaraderie we had. I hope we can see each other again soon. But the longing is obvious. In one letter from 1948, R wrote, "I had a dream about you last night. We were back on the ship. You were standing on the deck and the sun was behind you, and I could not see your face, but I knew it was you. I woke up and for a moment I forgot where I was. I forgot that the war was over. I forgot that you were 2,000 miles away. And then I remembered. And it hurt more than anything I felt during the war." Jay wrote back, "I dream about you too. I think I always will. But we cannot live in dreams. We have to live in the world. And the world does not let us have what we want. I am trying to build a life here. I hope you are doing the same. But I will never forget you. I will never forget what we had." The letters stopped in 1953. The museum does not know why. Maybe one of them got married. Maybe one of them died. Maybe they just could not take the pain anymore. But the letters survived, and now they are preserved. And anyone who reads them knows R and J loved each other. The war separated them. The world kept them apart. But the love was real. Some men tried to recreate the closeness they had felt during the war. They joined veterans organizations, the American Legion, the VFW. They went to the meetings. They wore their uniforms. They marched in parades. They were looking for the camaraderie, the brotherhood, the sense of belonging. But it was not the same. The veterans organizations were straight spaces, masculine spaces. You could not be gay there. You could not talk about the men you had loved. You could only talk about the battles, the ships, the glory. And for many gay veterans, that felt hollow. So some of them created their own spaces. Informal gatherings, a group of guys who had all served, who all happened to be gay, who got together once a month for dinner. These gatherings were never advertised. They were word of mouth. You had to know someone who knew someone. But they existed in almost every major city, and they were vital. They were the only places where gay veterans could talk honestly about their experiences, where they could say, "I fell in love during the war," where they could grieve the men they had lost, where they could be both veteran and gay at the same time. One such group met in Chicago from 1947 until the early 1960s. It started with 3 men. By the end, there were 20. They called themselves the Old Salts. They met at a different member's apartment every month. They cooked dinner together. They played cards. They talked. They supported each other. When one of them lost his job, The others helped him find a new one. When one of them got sick, the others took care of him. They were a chosen family, and they were proof that even in the most hostile environment, gay men found ways to survive together. The Old Salts disbanded in 1963. By then, the members were getting older. Some had died. Some had moved away. The era of informal secret gatherings was starting to give way to something else, the beginning of the gay rights movement. The men who had spent their youth hiding were watching a younger generation start to demand visibility. It was disorienting. Some of them were inspired, some of them were terrified, and some of them were just exhausted. One member of the Old Salts, a man named Richard Sullivan, was interviewed in 1983. He was 65. He said, "I spent my whole life hiding. I got good at it. I survived because I hid. And then these kids started marching in the streets, holding signs, demanding rights. And part of me thought, where were you when I needed you? But another part of me thought, good, let them fight. Let them have what we could not. Let them be free." Richard died in 1987. He never marched in a pride parade. He never came out to his family. He lived quietly, carefully, the way he had always lived. But he donated money to gay organizations. He supported the movement from a distance. And when he died, he left a letter to be opened after his death. The letter said, "I am gay. I always have been. I served my country. I loved men. I hid my whole life. I do not want anyone else to have to hide. Fight for them. Remember me. Do not let this happen again." Richard's letter was found by his landlord when the apartment was being cleared out. The landlord, a younger gay man who had come of age during the liberation movement of the 1970s, read the letter and wept. He had never known Richard was gay. Richard had been the quiet older man upstairs who kept to himself, who smiled politely in the hallway, who had lived alone for as long as anyone could remember. The landlord donated the letter to the Chicago History Museum. It sits in their archives now. On the envelope, Richard had written in careful cursive, "To whoever finds this, I existed. Remember that." That phrase appears again and again in the documents left behind by gay veterans. I existed. Remember that. As if existence itself was an act of defiance, as if being remembered was the only victory left. Let us talk about what it felt like to come home and have no one to tell. You walk off the ship. You set foot on American soil for the first time in 2 years. Your family is waiting. Your mother cries. Your father shakes your hand. Your kid's sister hugs you and says she missed you. Everyone wants to hear your stories. They want to know about the battles, the storms, the foreign ports. They want to know if you were scared. They want to know if you were brave. And you tell them the stories you are allowed to tell. You talk about the ship. You talk about your buddies. You talk about the food, the heat, the boredom, the moments of terror. You do not talk about the man you loved. You do not talk about the night you spent holding each other in a storage closet while depth charges shook the hull. You do not talk about the morning you woke up and found out his ship had gone down and he was gone. You do not talk about any of it, because how could you? They have no frame of reference. They have no language. And even if they did, they would not understand. They would pull away. They would look at you differently. So you stay silent. You smile. You say you are glad to be home, and you carry the truth alone. A veteran named Stanley Kowalski, no relation to the Tennessee Williams character, came home to Detroit in 1946. Stanley had served on a destroyer escort in the Atlantic. He had been in love with a radio man named Andy. They had been together for 11 months. Andy had been killed when a torpedo hit the engine room. Stanley had been on deck when it happened. He had heard the explosion. He had run below. He had seen the wreckage. He had not seen Andy's body. There was no body to see. The blast had been too powerful. Stanley had spent the next 4 months finishing his deployment in a state of numb shock. When he finally came home, his family threw a party. Neighbors came. Friends came. Everyone wanted to celebrate the returning hero. Stanley sat in the living room surrounded by people who loved him, and he felt completely alone. He could not tell them about Andy. He could not grieve. He could not even say Andy's name. So he drank. He drank until he could not feel anything. And when people asked if he was okay, he said he was fine. Just tired, just adjusting. Stanley never adjusted. He drank for the next 30 years. He went through jobs, apartments, relationships with women that never lasted. He told an interviewer in 1978, "I was already dead. I died the day Andy died. I just kept walking around for 30 more years." The interviewer asked if Stanley had ever tried to get help. Stanley laughed. He said, "Help for what? For being a queer? For loving someone I was not supposed to love? There was no help for that. There was just forgetting. And I tried. I really tried to forget. But I never did." Stanley died in 1981. He was 59. The cause of death was listed as cirrhosis of the liver, but anyone reading his story knows the real cause. He died of a broken heart. He died of a grief he was never allowed to express. He died of a love that had no place in the world, and he was not unique. Thousands of men came home carrying the same weight. Some of them drank. Some of them buried themselves in work. Some of them got married and tried to build normal lives. Some of them succeeded at the performance. Some of them did not. And some of them, like Stanley, just slowly eroded until there was nothing left. But let us not only tell the stories of the men who did not make it. Let us also tell the stories of the men who did. The men who came home and found ways to live, who built careers, who found love again, or at least found peace, who survived not just the war, but the aftermath. A sailor named Norman Wong served on a destroyer in the Pacific. Norman was Chinese-American, born in San Francisco. He had grown up in Chinatown, the son of immigrants who ran a laundry. He knew he was gay by the time he was 14, but he also knew he could never tell his family. Chinese culture, his parents' generation especially, had no room for that. So, Norman hid. He was good at it. And when he enlisted in 1942, he thought maybe the Navy would give him a chance to escape, to be someone else, to find a life his parents could never know about. The Navy was not kind to men like Norman. He faced racism constantly. Other sailors called him slurs. They mocked his accent even though he had been born in America and spoke perfect English. They assumed he was Japanese, even though Japan was the enemy, and Norman wore the same uniform they did. He learned to keep his head down. He did his job. He did not make waves, and he survived. But he also found love. On his ship, there was a gunner's mate named Michael O'Brien. Michael was Irish, from Boston, loud and brash, and everything Norman was not. But Michael noticed Norman. He saw past the racism, past the fear, past the walls Norman had built. And slowly, carefully, they became friends. Then more. They had 6 months together before the ship was reassigned and they were separated. But those 6 months mattered. They wrote letters. Michael was better at coded language than most. He wrote things like, "I remember the nights we stood watch together. I remember how quiet it was. I remember feeling like I was not alone." Norman understood. He wrote back, "I remember too. I will always remember." After the war, they tried to stay in touch. But it was harder for Norman. His family expected him to come home, to work in the laundry, to marry a Chinese girl they would choose for him. Norman went home. He worked in the laundry. But he did not marry. He made excuses. He said he was not ready. He said he wanted to save money first. His parents were disappointed, but they did not push too hard. And in the meantime, Norman saved every penny he could. He worked double shifts. He lived at home and paid no rent. And after 3 years, he had enough. He told his parents he was moving to Los Angeles for a job. They were upset, but they let him go. And Norman moved to Los Angeles and never came back. He did not find Michael. Michael had married by then. Michael had written one last letter in 1948 saying, "I cannot do this anymore. I have to move on. I hope you understand." Norman understood. He was heartbroken, but he understood. So he built a different life. He got a job at a printing shop. He rented a room in a boarding house in Silver Lake, which was becoming a neighborhood where gay men could live quietly. He went to the bars. He met other men. He had relationships. None of them were Michael, but they were something. They were proof that he could survive, that he could build a life on his own terms. Norman lived until 2006. He was 84 years old. He had spent 60 years in Los Angeles. He had never gone back to San Francisco. He had never reconciled with his family. They had disowned him after he left, though he did not know that until years later, when he tried to contact them and his letters were returned unopened. But he had built a chosen family. He had friends. He had a community. And in 1995, when he was 73, he met a man named David at a community center event. David was younger, 56, a teacher. They started dating. They moved in together. They were together for the last 11 years of Norman's life. Norman died at home. David was with him, and after Norman died, David found a box in the back of Norman's closet. Inside were letters from Michael O'Brien, dated 1945 to 1948. Letters that Norman had kept for 58 years. David read them, and he understood. He understood that he was not the first man Norman had loved. He understood that Michael had mattered in a way that no one else ever could, and he was not jealous, he was grateful. Because Michael had taught Norman that love was possible, and that lesson had carried Norman through 6 decades, until he met David. David donated the letters to the One Archives in Los Angeles. He wrote a note with them. These belonged to Norman Wong, who served in the Navy during World War II, and who loved a man named Michael O'Brien. Norman never forgot Michael, and now neither will anyone else. Let us talk about the ones who never found love again. The ones who had one great love during the war and spent the rest of their lives alone. Not because they wanted to be alone, but because they could not imagine loving anyone else. Because the war had given them something so intense, so pure, so impossible to replicate, that everything after felt like a pale imitation. A sailor named Thomas Brennan had a love like that. Thomas was from Philadelphia. He enlisted in 1943. He was assigned to an aircraft carrier in the Pacific. The carrier had a crew of over 2,000 men. Thomas worked in the engine room. It was hot, loud, dangerous work. The engine room was deep in the belly of the ship, below the waterline. If the ship took a hit, the engine room crew was often the first to die. Thomas knew that. Everyone who worked down there knew that. It created a bond, a dark, fatalistic camaraderie. They joked about it. They said things like, "If we go down, at least we go down together." And they meant it. Thomas met a man named Christopher in the engine room. Christopher was from Alabama, soft-spoken, thoughtful, the kind of guy who read books during downtime. Thomas was loud, brash, quick to laugh. They were opposites, but they worked well together. They stood the same watch shifts. They learned to read each other's rhythms. They became a team. And then, slowly, they became more. It started with small things. A hand on the shoulder after a long shift. A shared cigarette on the deck at night. A conversation that went deeper than it should have. And then one night, 6 months in, Christopher kissed Thomas. They were alone in the engine room during a lull. The engines hummed around them. The ship rocked gently. And Christopher just leaned over and kissed him. Thomas kissed him back. They did not talk about it. They just stood there, holding each other, listening to the engines, feeling the ship move beneath them. And Thomas thought, this is it. This is the thing I have been looking for my whole life. They were together for 14 months. 14 months of stolen moments, whispered promises, the constant fear of being caught. 14 months of the most intense love Thomas had ever felt. And then, in October 1944, the carrier was hit by a kamikaze. The plane struck the flight deck, and the explosion tore through the ship. The engine room flooded. 37 men died. Christopher was one of them. Thomas survived. He was on deck when it happened. He tried to go below to help. He was stopped by damage control. They would not let anyone down there. The compartment was sealed. The men inside were gone. Thomas spent the next 2 hours standing on the deck, staring at the hatch that led below, knowing Christopher was down there, knowing he was dead, knowing there was nothing he could do. When they finally opened the hatch, the bodies were unrecognizable. The heat, the water, the explosion. There was no way to identify anyone. Thomas was told Christopher was gone. That was all. Just gone. Thomas finished his deployment. He came home in 1945. He got a job in a factory. He lived with his parents. He never married. He never dated. He never spoke about Christopher. He lived alone for 61 years. He worked. He went to church. He kept to himself. In 2006, when he was 83, a hospice nurse asked him if there was anyone he wanted her to contact, anyone who should know he was dying. Thomas said no. The nurse said, "No family? No friends?" Thomas said, "There was someone once, but he died a long time ago." The nurse asked, "What was his name?" Thomas said, "Christopher." And then he died. The nurse wrote about Thomas in a journal article about end-of-life care for LGBTQ elders. She wrote, "He carried that name for 61 years. He never said it out loud to anyone, but he said it to me, and I think that mattered to him. I think he needed someone to know that Christopher had existed, that he had been loved. These are the stories that break my heart. The men who loved once and never again. The men who carried a name in silence for decades. The men who died alone because the world had taken away the one person who mattered. These men are everywhere in this history. And they deserve to be remembered just as much as the men who built lives, who found community, who survived. Now let us talk about resistance, because some men did not just survive, they fought back. Not in organized ways. This was decades before Stonewall, decades before the gay rights movement, but in small, quiet ways. They refused to disappear. They refused to be ashamed. They lived as openly as they could in a world that wanted them dead. A sailor named Jack Nichols, this one is the real Jack Nichols, a man who became a well-known gay activist in the 1960s, served in the army, not the Navy, but his story intersects because he was part of the generation of queer veterans who refused to stay silent. Jack was drafted in 1956 after the Korean War, but during the same era of intense homophobia. He served 2 years. He was gay. He knew it. And he decided early on that he was not going to hide. He was careful. He did not do anything that would get him court-martialed. But he also did not pretend. When other soldiers talked about women, he stayed quiet. When they asked if he had a girlfriend, he said no. When they pushed, he changed the subject. And some of them figured it out. Some of them suspected. But Jack did not care. He thought, if they want to come for me, let them come. I am not doing their work for them. Jack was never caught. He received an honorable discharge in 1958. And then he became an activist. He joined the Mattachine Society. He started writing for gay publications. He spoke publicly about his experience in the military. He said, "I served my country. I did my job. And I am gay." Those things are not contradictory. The military wants you to think they are. But they are not. I am proof. Jack died in 2005. He was 71. He had spent 50 years fighting for gay rights. And his fight started in the military. It started when he decided he was not going to hate himself just because the world told him to. That decision, that refusal to internalize the shame, was an act of resistance, and it paved the way for the men who came after him. But Jack had resources, he had education, he had family support eventually. Most gay sailors did not have those things. Most of them were working-class kids who had enlisted because they had no other options. They did not have the privilege to resist openly. They had to survive first. Resistance, for them, looked different. It looked like refusing to name names during an interrogation. It looked like warning another gay sailor that someone was asking questions. It looked like keeping a letter hidden for 60 years so that someday someone might find it and know the truth. Resistance looked like Richard Sullivan donating money to gay organizations, even though he never marched. It looked like Norman Wong moving to Los Angeles and building a life on his own terms, even though it meant losing his family. It looked like Donald Vining writing in his diary every night, documenting his life, refusing to let his existence be erased. These were not grand gestures. They were small, private acts of defiance. But they mattered. They kept the history alive. Let me tell you about the reunion. In 1985, a veteran named Walter Young placed an ad in a gay newspaper in San Francisco. The ad said, "Seeking men who served in the Navy during World War II. I want to hear your stories. Let us remember together." Walter had served on a cruiser in the Pacific. He had never spoken publicly about being gay, but he was 65 years old, retired, and tired of the silence. He wanted to connect with other men who had lived through what he had lived through. He wanted to know he was not alone. 30 men responded to the ad. 30 gay veterans, all living in the Bay Area, all with stories they had never told. Walter organized a meeting. They met at a community center in the Castro. It was awkward at first. These were men in their 60s and 70s, men who had spent their entire lives hiding. Sitting in a room and openly identifying as gay veterans felt surreal. Dangerous even, though the danger was mostly in their heads. Old habits die hard, but once they started talking, they could not stop. They talked for hours. They told stories about their ships, their lovers, their fears, their survival strategies. They cried, they laughed, they held each other, and they realized, we made it, we survived, we are still here. Walter later said, "That night changed my life. For the first time, I was not alone. For the first time, I was with men who understood." The group kept meeting. They called themselves the Sea Scouts, a tongue-in-cheek reference to their Navy service. They met once a month. They supported each other. They documented their stories. And when the AIDS crisis hit in the 1980s, they were already organized. They became caregivers. They raised money. They fought for their community. The skills they had learned in the military, discipline, resilience, loyalty, became tools for survival in a new kind of war. By 2000, most of the Sea Scouts had died. Walter was one of the last. He died in 2003, but before he died, he donated the group's archives to the LGBT Historical Society in San Francisco. The archives include letters, photographs, meeting notes, and recorded oral histories. 30 men who had served in silence finally got to speak, and their voices are preserved forever. This is what community does. It transforms survival into resistance. It transforms isolation into connection. It transforms shame into pride. The gay sailors of World War II did not have community during the war. They had to build it afterward. And they did. In bars, in apartments, in informal gatherings, in classified ads, in archives. They built it piece by piece. And that community is what allowed the next generation to demand more, to demand rights, to demand visibility, to demand that the world see them as they were. The stories I have told you tonight are just a fraction of what happened. For every name I have said out loud, there are 100 others lost to history. For every letter preserved in an archive, there are 1,000 that were burned. For every veteran who spoke to a researcher, there are 10,000 who took the truth to their graves. The full story of gay sailors in World War II will never be known. Too much was hidden. Too much was destroyed. Too much was deliberately erased by men who were terrified of being remembered. But here is what we do know. We know they existed. We know they served. We know they loved each other in the shadow of war. in the belly of ships, in the chaos of battle, in the quiet moments between watch shifts when the ocean was dark and the stars were the only witnesses. We know they risked everything, not just their lives in combat, but their identities, their futures, their very sense of self. We know that some of them survived the war only to be destroyed by the peace. And we know that others survived everything, built lives in the margins, and refused to let shame define them. The military has changed since World War II, slowly, painfully. The ban on gay service members was not officially lifted until 2011, when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed. Think about that. 66 years after the end of World War II, the military finally acknowledged that gay people could serve openly. 66 years. 2 full generations of gay service members who had to hide, who had to lie, who had to live in fear of discovery. The men who served in World War II never got to see that change. Most of them were dead by 2011. They lived their entire lives in a military that considered their existence incompatible with service. They were told they were security risks, moral failures, threats to unit cohesion. And they believed it, many of them, because they had no other narrative. The world told them they were wrong, and they internalized that message, and it ate them alive. But some of them refused to believe it. Some of them knew, deep down, that the world was wrong and they were right. That love was not a crime. That desire was not a disease. That they were not broken. Those men, the ones who held on to that knowledge even when everything around them said otherwise, those men were the ones who survived with their humanity intact, and they are the ones who paved the way for change. In 2013, 2 years after the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the Navy issued a formal apology, not to all gay veterans, just to one. His name was Edward Butts, not the Ed Butts I mentioned earlier, different man, different story. And he had been discharged in 1957 for homosexuality after 23 years of service. Edward had fought the discharge. He had written letters. He had appealed. He had spent decades trying to get his discharge upgraded to honourable. And finally, in 2013, the Navy relented. They upgraded his discharge. They issued a formal apology. They said, "We were wrong. You served with honour. We are sorry." Edward was 92 years old when he received the apology. He had waited 56 years. He cried when he read the letter. He told a reporter, "I knew I was right. I always knew. But it means something to hear them say it. It means I can die knowing my service mattered." Edward died in 2016. He was 95. His obituary mentioned his Navy service, his honourable discharge, his fight for justice. It mentioned that he had been gay, and it mentioned that he had won. But Edward was one man. Thousands of others never got apologies, never got their discharges upgraded, never got acknowledgement. They died knowing the military had branded them as undesirable, and that brand stayed with them until the end. That is the cost. That is what this history demands we remember. Not just the love, not just the survival, but the cruelty. The institutional cruelty that destroyed lives for no reason other than fear and prejudice. The question I keep coming back to is, what did we lose? What did the world lose when it forced these men into hiding? How many great leaders, artists, thinkers, healers were among those 400,000 gay sailors? How many of them could have done more, been more, contributed more, if they had been allowed to live openly? We will never know. We lost their potential along with their stories. We lost the fullness of who they could have been. And that loss is incalculable. But we did not lose everything. We have the fragments, the letters, the diaries, the photographs, the interviews. We have the archives that activists like James Kepner spent their lives building. We have the researchers like Alan Berube, who dedicated decades to finding the voices that history tried to silence. We have the families, the nieces, the nephews, the chosen kin, who found boxes in attics and decided to donate them instead of burning them. We have the men who, in their final years, decided to speak. To sit down with a researcher and say, "Let me tell you what it was really like." Those fragments matter. They allow us to reconstruct imperfectly the lives that were lived. They allow us to say their names. They allow us to honor them. And honoring them means more than just remembering. It means learning. It means asking, what are we doing now that future generations will look back on with horror? Who are we erasing now? Who are we forcing into hiding now? The structures that destroyed gay sailors in World War II did not disappear. They evolved. They adapted. They found new targets. The fight is not over. It will never be fully over. But every generation that refuses to stay silent makes it a little bit easier for the next. The men I have told you about tonight, Robert and Jack, George and Leo, Donald, Carl, Bernard, Norman, Thomas, Vincent, Harold and Lewis, Stanley, Richard, Walter, Edward, they were ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances. They were not heroes in the traditional sense. They did not storm beaches or raise flags on mountaintops. They just loved. And they survived. And in a world that wanted them dead, survival was heroism. Love was resistance. Existence was victory. I think about them often. I think about the sailor standing on the deck of a ship in the middle of the Pacific, staring at the stars, thinking about the man sleeping below. I think about the two men holding each other in a storage closet while depth charges exploded in the water around them. I think about the letter written in careful code, carried across an ocean, kept in a shoebox for 60 years. I think about the man who died alone at 83, whispering a name he had not said out loud in 6 decades. I think about the reunion in 1985, 30 men sitting in a room together, finally allowed to speak their truth. I think about all of it, and I feel the weight of it. The love, the loss, the courage, the loneliness, the refusal to disappear. These men were not abstractions. They were not statistics. They were people. They had freckles and bad jokes and favorite songs and terrible handwriting. They got seasick. They missed their mothers. They were scared of dying. They fell in love at the worst possible time, in the worst possible place. And they carried that love with them, through the war, through the decades after, through marriages and jobs and silence and shame. Because love, once felt, cannot be unfelt. It stays. It becomes part of you. And even when the world tells you to forget, you remember. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, think about them. Think about the gay sailors of World War II. Think about the men who served their country while hiding who they were. Think about the men who loved each other in the spaces between the rules. Think about the men who survived, and the men who did not. Think about the archives full of letters they wrote, the photographs they saved, the stories they finally told. Think about the fact that they existed, that they were real, that they mattered. And if you are gay, if you are queer, if you have ever felt like you had to hide, know that you come from a long line of people who hid and survived. Know that your existence is built on their shoulders. Know that they would be proud of you. Proud that you get to live more openly than they ever could. Proud that you get to love without as much fear. Proud that you get to say the words they could not say. You are the future they dreamed of. You are the reason their survival mattered. And if you are not gay, if you are here just listening, just learning, thank you. Thank you for bearing witness. Thank you for refusing to let these men be forgotten. Thank you for understanding that their stories are part of the larger human story, that love, in all its forms, deserves to be honored, that no one should have to hide who they are just to survive, that we owe it to the past to build a better future. The Navy has ships named after battles, after presidents, after states, but there is no ship named after Robert Fleischer or George Matlovich or Harold Norris or any of the men I told you about tonight. There is no monument, no plaque, no official recognition that they existed and mattered. Maybe there should be. Maybe someday there will be. But until then, we have this. We have the stories. We have the act of remembering. We have nights like tonight, where their names are said out loud, where their love is honored, where they are not alone anymore. They were sailors. They were lovers. They were men who did their duty while carrying a secret that could destroy them. They stood watch in the dark. They loaded guns and launched planes and kept the engines running. They fought the enemy, and they fought a different war. A war within themselves, a war against a world that told them they were wrong. Some of them won that war. Some of them lost, but all of them fought, and all of them deserve to be remembered. So if this story stayed with you, if these men stayed with you, the like button is right there. It helps the algorithm show this video to others who need to hear it, to other gay people looking for their history, to other veterans wondering if they were the only ones, to other human beings trying to understand what love looks like when the world is against you. You do not have to, but if it mattered, it helps. May your dreams tonight be free of depth charges and interrogations and blue discharge papers. May you sleep in a world where no one has to hide who they love. May you wake up grateful for the freedoms that men like these never had. And may you carry their names forward into a future they could barely imagine but fought to make possible. Good night and sleep well.